Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the next installment in my net making video series. In this particular part we're going to actually be starting our net, and so the first thing you're going to have to do is get you a place to attach your net, a stable platform from which you can be pulling knots. I have a TV tray that I got from Goodwill. I got 4 of these for less than $25, and I've got a C-clamp attached to it. Now on its own, this is not a stable platform, but I also have my tool bag up here, and it's got a lot of stuff in it, including about 5 pounds of lead weights on the bottom, and that seems to be stable enough for what we're doing today. Now, the next thing you're going to need is what you're going to tie your net to, and it's going to either be a loop of rope or a swivel. Before you start your net, it'd be a good idea to make a decision about what kind of net you're going to be making. Obviously, it's going to be a cast net, but cast nets come in 2 varieties. The first one that we're mostly familiar with would be the English style or brill net. This is basically the kind of nets that they sell at large box type stores. The other type is the Spanish or bag style net, which is traditionally made for catching larger fish. Now, both nets will catch just about anything that falls into them, but the brill net is much better suited for catching small bait fish or shrimp. The Spanish style or bag net is better suited for catching large kinds of fish such as mullet. But basically anything that's under your net when it hits the water is going to get caught in it. Now if we're making a Spanish net or bag net, we may want to start directly onto a swivel. If we're making a brill net, then we have no choice but to start our net on a piece of line. Now the good news is if you start your net on a piece of line, later you can make the decision to still use that net as a Spanish or bag style net. And the reason that's true is, and I'll demonstrate, is because this is what your bag or Spanish net is going to look like when it's started directly onto a swivel. However, if you start your net on a piece of line like this, you can still tie your net off to a swivel. And it's very easy because you remember you can still untie this and actually make it however you want to on your net. In fact, you can make it just like this and loop the entire net through your swivel. If you've decided that you're going to tie your first row of headers onto a piece of line, you can't simply tie that onto a piece of line laying on a table. It has to be firmly attached to something that is structurally sound so that you can put a little pressure when tying your knots. You need to have a loop about the size of the palm of your hand. Now, while we're talking about making a loop for tying our headers, I'm going to show you the best knot for doing that. And that knot is a square knot. A square knot is a very valuable knot to have, even if you don't plan on ever making a cast net. And all you're going to do is simply take your line and, as if tying a half hitch, twirl one line around the other, and then double line back and continue twirling that piece of line around the line you're doubling back. If your knot does this when you're done, then that is a square knot. An alternate to this that is not very good is what's known as a granny knot. A granny knot seems to be the same thing, but it isn't. Once again, you're going to twirl your line around as if you're making a half hitch, only this time you're going to twirl around the opposite direction of your initial twirl. And you end up with something like this. Still seems to do the same thing, but it's not the same knot, and it's not quite as stable. Just remember that when you're making a square knot, it should always end up being square. And the two lines that have the load, which in our case are the two ends of the loop, should be on the same side of the square knot. We are now going to start a braille net. I call it a braille net because a lot of what I learned is from books, and the word is spelled B-R-A-I-L-L-E, which to me is braille. But I've never heard anyone call it that except me. It is normally referred to as a brill net. So if you want to sound like you know what you're doing, always refer to this type of net as a brill net. The first knot we're going to tie is going to be a square knot. Square knots don't slip, so there is a benefit to tying this kind of knot. You're going to actually take the line that's on the end of your needle and throw it over the top of your loop, and then take the tail and face it to your right. That is if you're right-handed, because that's going to be the direction you're working. And tie a square knot. When you finish tying your square knot, the tail will be facing the opposite direction. And I suggest you make your loop exactly how big you want to make it, because square knots hold pretty good. Now when you go to hem your net up, as we work, we're going to be working this way. We're going to end up with our hem right here, our seam. And so this piece is what we're going to tie to when we hem our net up. Okay, that was for demonstration purposes only. But if you do that, if you start your net this way, just go ahead and keep it there. Me, I'm going to cut it off because I want to teach the simplest possible way to do this, which would mean using one knot throughout. Using one knot throughout, once again, we're going to throw our line over the top. I'm going to grab enough of it that it doesn't slip. In fact, we'll go ahead and double wrap that around so it doesn't slip out of my fingers. We're going to adjust for however long we want our loops. We're going to tie our first knot. And throw a loop, come up through the loop, and go back down, and come up again, and pull it down. And steer your knot to the top of the gauge using your thumb. Just work it right to where you want it. And that's a pretty secure knot right there. And the reason, like I said, the reason I even am showing you this knot, even though it's not traditional to start with that knot, is because that is the exact knot we're going to use in all of our headers. The traditional net that's made here where I live, it has 33 headers. So that's what we're going to do in our net. We're not going to get fancy until after you get used to doing this kind of stuff. Once you feel that you're comfortable, then you can alter the geometry of the net. If you've noticed, I just used a regular half hitch to tie that, and we weren't using half hitches, we were actually doubling them, and since I failed to do that, we're going to fix that right now by going back and tying another half hitch on top of that half hitch. You're really only going to tie 2 knots to complete your net, but it's actually going to be 4 knots. We'll cover that later, and in fact we'll cover other ways to make these knots that are a little bit more complicated, but not on your first net. Once again, we are going to go through the loop twice, steer it up with our thumb. And every time we're just going to keep moving those lines down, and we're going to keep giving ourselves a little bit more line off of our needle, and we just go through our swivel or our piece of rope, pull it down so that those 2 lines are together, throw a loop, come up on the left side of the loop, or of the left side of the 2 lines, and go through our loop twice and pull it down tight. And we're going to make 33 of these. Now in the process of doing this, something you want to keep an eye out for is where you're laying your lines on the rope. You do not want this to go on top of your strings, because that makes it a little bit uneven. You want to make sure that every time you're next to the previous header. There's another one, and as I said, we're going to make 33 of these. So we're going to count 33 knots. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on here now. As you make more and more, you could actually go all the way to the end without taking anything off on your first row of headers, but because of this loop here, you're going to end up with uneven headers. So you don't want to go that far. As you progress, you're going to throw some of your headers off of the side of your gauge. Now we'll take a closer look at the 2 knots used in starting a net. And we're going to be tying on to this iron ring. I can't think of any situation where you would be starting a net on an iron ring, but from what I understand, they sell some kind of a horn now that you actually sew onto a ring and the ring snaps into the horn. But I'm not familiar with it. If I find something like that on the internet, I'll put a link to it at the bottom of the page. And the first thing we're going to do is put our very first knot on. We're going to put our line coming over the top of our gauge or mesh stick, and we're going to always, as we're making a cast net, go under our mesh and through the bottom of whatever we're tying on to. And as I said, there may be a situation where you can use a ring if there is a device that incorporates a ring into a horn, but I haven't seen such a device. Normally we would be tying on to a swivel or a piece of rope tied together at the ends. Now, when we come up under the ring, if you turn it, you can see there's 2 lines, a line on the back of the gauge and the back of the ring, and where it comes back down the front. We are going to throw a loop over to the left side, and we're going to come up between that loop and the 2 lines we just ran through our ring. Now, what I'm about to do is not the way you're actually going to start your net. This is a half hitch. I am using large unbonded nylon to show you in a rather exaggerated way the drawbacks of this knot. The very first knot you make, it's going to be very slippery. Now, if we're pulling it like this, it's pretty tight. It's not going anywhere. But if we pull back, it's going to slip. This is nothing more than a slip knot, and that may make you a little bit uneasy, knowing that you're putting together something that could fall apart. But it's not a big deal. Now, most people say that you should make the first net of your very first header, and by the way, that's what this is called, is a header. The very first header should be tied with a square knot. I can see that there might be benefits. This knot, this half hitch, has your line hanging straight down. If this were a square knot, the line would be going that way, which I guess somehow makes it a little bit more useful for sewing your net up, because this piece of line that's left hanging is what you're going to tie your line to when you sew the hem of your net together. But I don't see enough benefit, if there is any, and so what I like to do is put a double half hitch. Now, occasionally when you're doing this, you may just be in the zone or something and don't think about what you're doing and put this slip knot, this half hitch on here. Well, if you do that, you can still save it. You don't have to untie it and do it again. You can just put another half hitch on top of that one. Of course, that's not going to work. Oh, and there you go. That's much more secure. However, instead of doing a single half hitch and then putting another one on top of it, you can do this all in pretty much one fluid motion by, once again, we'll show you that. Once again, you're going to go down over the front of your gauge, wrap around the bottom and come back up and go through your swivel or your rope. And you're going to pull it until these lines are pretty much even with one another. You're going to tie this one just like the first one. Only this time we're going to do, after we throw our loop, we're going to come up, and we're not going to come up over here and tie them all together. We're going to come up here next to the 2 we just laid out. Come up. go back and come up again. And as you'll see, you get basically the same knot, but I think a lot better. And that's what we're going to do all of our headers with. And yes, it will still slip, but not quite as bad. This is also the knot we're going to use later when we start making wideners. And I don't really know the name of this knot. I thought maybe a double half hitch or a full hitch, but I really don't know, and we'll demonstrate that again. We pull down so that we have our two lines right there next to each other. Make our loop. Come up between the loop and the two lines that we have running next to each other. And guide it with our thumb so that it's sitting directly on top of the gauge. If you notice, your gauge is straight and your ring is always going to be curved. So if you were to put every one of your lines on here, all your headers, you would end up with headers that were very long on either end and headers that are short in the middle. So what we're going to do, after we get a few headers tied on, we're going to slide our completed headers off the edge of our gauge. Once again, we've run a loop around our swivel or our rope, and we come through with our needle, drop back down, and come through again, and guide it up with our thumb. So now we've got 4 headers on our ring. We're going to slide a couple off of the end. Once those are slid off, we can do another one. Come up through your ring. And one of the problems you will have with this little tail you leave on here is that it will tangle up in your work. So you kind of got to be wary of that, at least while you're making your headers, maybe after you make your first row, or till you make your first row. Here we go once again. Come up through our ring, right a loop, come up next to those 2 we just laid, go back down and come up again, and guide our knot to the top of our gauge with our thumb. And what you're going to get is something like this. Now this is an unbonded large nylon slippery line. So right now I'm going to go take all of this off the ring, and I'm going to tie my headers on using a black line that is black because it is bonded with tar. That'll make it much more sticky, much less susceptible to slipping out. We now have accumulated 20 headers on here. That's way too much. You see how this is starting to bunch up? You'll get uneven headers like this. Now I didn't knit it with all that on there. I just put it on there, put it back on there to show you why this can be a problem. So we are never going to let that many get on when we're doing our header lines. On your headers you should always have maybe 3 or 4. As you get farther down the net, when you're 5 feet away from this, you can go as far as your hand will handle it, because as long as you can reach with your fingers and thumbs, that's fine. You're not going to be pulling your meshes open or making your headers crooked or anything like that. We'll get down to about 3, and we'll continue on. Now you see how this is starting to flip around. You really can't allow that to happen. I mean, you can allow it to happen, but you can't start making your second row with all this mixed up. They have to be nice and even and tidy and hanging on the right side of the rope, otherwise you're just going to have a mess. Now one thing I will show you, say you pull your gauge out and you store your net for another day, you're going to have to put your gauge back in there to start your work. Always when you reinsert your gauge into your work, you're going to come in from the top. You're working to your right if you're right-handed, and you're going to come in from the top. Now some people want to have several meshes on their gauge. Well, if you do that, you twist and come into the top of the next one, and come into the top of the next one. And that way it's just like you would have had it if you had left it in there to start with. Now this will become an issue, and you're going to have to get that out of your way. Otherwise you're going to be tying your headers and then later your meshes into the other side of your net. So you're going to always want to keep this out of your work, and as you get more on your net you can actually put a hook somewhere on the table that you can lay your net over, and that'll pretty much take care of the problem. But we've got 20 headers on here, so that means we have to put 13 more. Okay, now we're going to take a closer look at reinserting our gauge so that there won't be any confusion whatsoever. This is the side from which we started, and there's our little tail. And go across to where we tied our very last knot, and you can see it here on the still on the needle. Set your needle down and grab your gauge, and you're going to go in through the top of the last loop you tied, or the last loop you created, or last header. And you're going to twirl your gauge around, come into the top of the next one, and you really only need to do the one. You don't really have to twirl it around several of these, but 2 should do. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can actually keep going and going until you have quite a few on there. If you're down lower on the net, up on the headers, you really don't want to go any further. But when you're tying your mesh knots and you're a couple of feet away from your ring or your rope or your swivel, then you can put as many of these on as you want. As you're making your net, you need to be regularly counting to make sure of how many headers you're creating. You only want to create 33. Now 33 is the perfect number when you are starting a cast net for wade fishing. This is a net that opens out into the shape of a pancake. It's the best net for starting out when you're learning, but later on you may want to make nets that are more appropriate for deep water fishing, that are not shaped like a pancake but shaped like an upside down bowl or a teepee. As far as the artistry of net making goes, the sky's the limit. But when you get done and you know that you got your 33, you're pretty sure you got 33, you are going to stop and you are going to count twice. Now, a regular beginner's mistake is to count these loops at the bottom. These are the loops from which you are going to tie off your next row, which is going to be a mesh row. And the reason that you're not going to count these is because there will only be 32. You only get one of these loops beneath 2 headers. So you're going to end up with 1 less than you are headers. Every header has a knot, every header has a loop, so I always count the knots. Now, where do you get your 33rd mesh? This little tail. Once this tail is tied across to the other side of the net, when you finally finish and spread your net around your ring, you'll have 33 meshes directly beneath your 33 headers. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 13, 14, 15, 16, 31, 32, 33. Now over here you may have noticed I missed counting a knot, because that is not a header knot. That is simply a knot that is where I had to tie in new line. Using this large rope, I was unable to get enough line on my needle to do a complete row. So I had to stop and add line in, and we'll show you how to do that in a minute. But that's what 33 headers look like, at least when tied onto a galvanized ring with large rope. And it's basically what it'll look like when you get finished with your header row. If you've been following the series for a while, then you already know that I have a pretty good selection of line. And it's not just that the lines are different colors, they're also rated at different sizes. This is a number 6, and I write the numbers inside of the roll, if you can see that. I've actually written the number 6 in this one and the word SIX on the other end, just because I don't want to confuse it with a number 9 line. The reason that we have so many different sizes is because a heavier line is more durable. But if you make a net out of nothing but heavy line, it doesn't sink very fast, which allows your fish to get out from under it before they're caught. And so the reason for that is a net is very much like a parachute, and even though it's like a parachute that's full of holes, water is extremely dense. And if you think this is like inconsequential, the first time you ever try to throw your net, you will see that the speed that your net gets to the bottom will be important to you. Now, where a net gets it, or a line gets its rating, is actually pretty simple. This is a number 72 line. What that means, now this is what they call 3-strand. If we were to separate this, we would find that the reason it's called 3-strand is because it's actually made from 3 strands. Now, if we went further and dissected these 3 individual strands, we'd find that each one of them is made up of 24 individual fibers. So 3 times 24 is 72, and that's where we get our rating. The top of the net, which this represents the top of your net, this is where your headers are. There are going to be 33 headers, but these 33 headers, after a few rows, are going to be increased to 44 meshes. After a few more rows, it's going to be increased to 55, 66, 77, and depending on the size of your mesh and the size of your net, you can get well over 1,000 meshes in the bottom of your net. So these 33 at the top have to support the weight of everything that's beneath it. And it's not just going to be net, it's not just going to be wet net, it's going to be a wet net full of fish. It is not uncommon to catch over 100 pounds of fish in a single throw. And so this is going to be a high stress area on your net. It's just by that fact alone, it's going to have to be more durable than the rest of your net. By tradition, cast nets have always been between 4 and 8 feet. Nowadays, people have nets that are 14 feet, which to me is ridiculous. I have seen people successfully throw those in such a way that they open all the way up. I can't do it. So for me, 8 foot is pretty much the limit. If you're going to make a net between 4 and 8 foot, you can start your net with number 9 line and then switch over to number 3 or number 4. For me, I'm making my entire net out of number 6 because at this point I am not good enough to be knitting with number 3 or number 4. It seems to cause me a lot of problems that hopefully I will work out by the time I get to my 4th net. Using number 6, we still have to start our net with number 9, but I am about to show you a way around that. If you've got number 6 or number 4, you can simply double up your line. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to take, and this is a number 6, we're going to take a number 6 that's white, and we're going to take a number 6 that's green, and we're going to roll both lines onto our needle at once. So we're actually going to be knitting with 2 strands of line. And since both are number 6, what we're actually doing is starting our net with what is equal to a number 12 line. In part 3 of this series, I showed you how to load a needle, so we don't have to go into the intimate details of how to put string on a needle at this time. However, since we are doing something a little different, which is putting 2 pieces of line on a needle at the same time, I will show you that just to make sure you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And we're going to load our needle as if this was a single piece of line. Now, I highlighted earlier how important it was to keep your line neat and keep your line tight. When you're using double line, it's even more important. Now, the reason I'm using 2 different colors is so that you can see it, and it's not just for decoration. When you're knitting with double line, your lines are going to get separated from each other, and you're going to have to know which side to pull to tighten up and which side not to pull, because they will come down on your gauge board unevenly. And a lot of the way we fix that is by making sure we load our needle up evenly, but it's also by having 2 different colors of line so that we can see what we're doing. It's not that you can't do this with one color line. It's just that it's much, much easier if you have some contrast so you can follow what's going on. And that's what your needle is going to look like as you load it up. Obviously, as I said before, this could be a Spanish style net. All we would have to do is finish our net in a Spanish style, then tie this large line onto a swivel, and we'd be good to go. I think it just does a whole lot nicer job with a much more better finished appearance if you tie directly onto the swivel. Now, the swivels I've used in previous nets were chrome plated brass, and that's just fine, but recently while at the Fisherman's Museum I noticed the 3 antique nets that were hanging on the wall all used brass swivels, and the brass was not shiny like this. It had dulled out, but it was obviously unplated brass, and I want to try to keep my nets as authentic as possible, so I picked these 2 up at the farm supply house. I was intending on using this one, because I couldn't imagine my needle fitting through this, but I think we can. We'll go ahead and start on this. We'll probably have to end up adding line somewhere because we'll run out early. My needle can't be loaded up too much through this small spindle. But this is going to be our Spanish style net, and this is a net that I'm going to use doubled up line on. This is the green and white line that we just loaded onto our needle, and because this space is so small, my needle won't really fit through there completely loaded. So I've intentionally overloaded the needle, and knowingly that I was going to have to unroll it some and just work with a sloppy mess for the first couple of knots. And I'm going to start this one off the traditional way by using a square knot. And as I said earlier, you don't have to do that, but the square knot is a better knot for starting for a few reasons. And so if you can do a square knot and it doesn't confuse you too much, doesn't frustrate you, go ahead. Square knot, we're going to swirl around this line, right, facing towards our work. We're going to be going from left to right, and then we're going to double back, swirl around the other side, so that the tail on our net, on our headers, it is heading that way. And I don't want my headers to be quite this large, so we'll take up some of this slack and tie it right about there. You really want your headers to be about the same size as your meshes. It's not really that critical. So we've got our first line tied, and we're going to make sure that we don't let our spindle keep turning as we're knitting. We'll have our net meshes going back and forth instead of all on the same side, and they have to be on the same side. So the next one we're going to do is going to be the same length as the one we just did, and we're going to pull our line down so that the knot is on top. We're going to run up under the mesh board, our gauge, and up underneath this swivel. We're still a little bit tight, but I'm going to try to get it through there without snagging my line. There we go. And we're going to pull it so that our two lines end up being the same length as the previous header. And you can see how you can do that. You just, as you're pulling line, you pull it until your gauge touches the first knot you did, and then you tie another knot. Now, there is you do have to be a little bit more careful when you're doubling your line like this, because it'll turn into a sloppy mess if you don't keep all your lines nice and taut. We're going to come through like we did in our previous net twice, and then like we did in the previous net, we are going to guide our line down with our thumb. And like I said, you got to keep both lines about the same length, or you'll end up with a sloppy mess. You don't want that. And look how pretty that knot comes out. I don't know if you can see it, but the green and the white just absolutely twirl around each other like a spring. And we'll do another one. And in fact, we are going to do how many? That's right, 33, because we're still making a pancake style net. And the best way to do that is to start with 33 headers and use 11 wideners from top to bottom. Here we do again. Make our loop, come up twice, and guide it down with our thumb evenly. The green and the white line coming down evenly. Guide it with your thumb. And we're going to do that. Looks like we got 3 there. We'll do it 30 more times. Well, that concludes this particular installment of my net making video series. And if you've got your own needle and you got your own gauge and you got your own materials, you may also got this. Your very first starting row for your very first cast net, also known as a header row. Now, I'm going to tell you something that's going to be a little discouraging to you. I only spent about 10 minutes making this. I already know you spent much more time making yours than 10 minutes, because the first one I made actually required me driving about 30 miles twice to go sit in a class with my teacher while he struggled to try to make me understand how to do this. hopefully you won't have that much of a problem, but if you do, just know that it's par for the course. I'm not that proud of that one. I've done that. I've been there, you know. But this one I'm very proud of, because you got to see me, actually witness me making my very first cast net directly onto a brass swivel using doubled up line. I hope you can see the details on that. And it was a little bit more difficult. This took me about a half an hour, and it may be that that's as fast as you can do it when you're working with this size needle going through that size of a swivel. But in any case, you'll actually be here for both the completion of both of these nets. I will continue to make this series until I have a complete braille net, as well as a complete Spanish net or bag net. And also, something else I'm proud of is this. My big rope demo net. This is not going to help anybody to catch fish, but it may help someone to learn how to make a cast net. Not just for this video series, but I also help to teach people cast net making at the Seafood Museum, and I do demos at historic reenactments, things of that nature. So it'll make it a lot easier for me to show people what's going on with this than it will with them two little teeny tiny things, because thread is very, very hard to see. This is very easy to see. In any case, I hope that you will help me to save or even resurrect this lost art, and I hope you understand that using your hands to do things sets you apart from other people. The vast majority of human beings within the empire have very little left in the way of skill sets, and in the very near future, having some kind of skill set is going to be very, very important. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.